Hi, my name's Clive Titmuss, and we're talking to you today from the Early Music Studio. In connection with a video that Susan just made of a Beethoven sonata, we thought we would talk a little bit about our Broadwood piano here. We first received this piano in 2007. It was essentially a wreck. It had to be restored. It was very capably done by a friend of ours, Marinus Van Prattenburg in Surrey. And we thought we would kind of go over the features of the instrument a little bit, talk about how it differs from a modern one, some of the stories that this instrument has to tell. There are marks all over it which say various things about the instrument, and there's a story there, and we'll try to decipher some of that. The other important thing you should know is that in 1818, 5 of Beethoven's former students got together. They were living in London at the time, where Broadwood had his factory. And they talked to John Broadwood, and Mr. Broadwood decided that he would send Beethoven, who was then a very famous man, one of his grand pianos. So it left the port in London, presumably in the Thames, and it made its way down to Trieste, around into the Mediterranean and around Italy and up to Trieste, and it was carried over the Alps. And Beethoven didn't receive it until 3 years later. So it took quite a journey. But when Beethoven received it, he was very, very enthusiastic about it and thought that it represented a major leap forward in piano technology at the time. It was very different from the instruments that he was used to in Vienna, which had the so-called Wiener Mechanik, the Viennese action. This instrument has the English action, which is quite different. You can see from its size how much larger it is than those instruments. It has an extended range. Instead of the key levers or the hammers actually sitting on the levers, the entire action sits on top of the keyboard, and it presents the possibility of the player can use considerably more force to strike the keys and produce a louder sound. There are a number of other design features. We'll talk about them in the course of our little exposition here, but I thought one of the things I wanted to talk about right away was this piece of the instrument right here. John Broadwood came from Scotland to London, and he was an apprentice to a maker there, a harpsichord and piano maker, but he was a cabinet maker at the time. He didn't make instruments yet. He was a cabinet maker. So I think this is clearly shown by this, because at the time, furniture had this style which is called banding. So this is mahogany, and this piece here is maple. It's quite yellowed now, but you can see that. And it has all these marks in it from use and from being moved around, being banged around. This instrument was built in 1809, and I'll show you the date later on in our little video here. One of the things that surprised me when we first got this instrument was that it had been in some kind of great house in a room, a large room, and maybe the maid waxed and polished this part of the instrument maybe every week. The rest of the instrument was completely black. It was covered with bitumen or resin from coal, because they used coal gas to light for many years in London. And the whole thing had acquired this ghastly blackish thing. We didn't even realize that this stringing was here. This is probably ebony or resin, and these pieces of wood are very thin. The case of the instrument, most of it is made from spruce. That makes it very lively sounding, and many of the southern German instruments and Viennese instruments would have been made principally from walnut. The cases were made from walnut or from poplar or other heavier woods, but the instruments by Broadwood are mostly spruce, so that makes it a very lively instrument. When the instrument was opened up and we could see the framing inside, the spruce looked as if it had been put there yesterday. It was incredible to see. So now let's talk about some of these typical English piano features. One of them is the hardware. This is all brass. It's all been made by hand. And another thing about it is this delightful music desk here, which is very nicely engineered, and it has these sliding panels which allow for you to put a candelabra right there. Now I'm going to talk about some of the other features. One of the big differences between Beethoven's instrument and this instrument is from a slightly earlier period, although the design of the instrument is the same. At the time, they were still putting these pianos on a stand like a harpsichord, which means that the pedals are kind of further forward. By the time Beethoven got his instrument, it was equipped with legs, and the pedal lyre was moved further back, a little bit more ergonomic. One of the things I had to do when I participated in the refinishing of this instrument, I had to clean it all off using a solvent and getting all that black goo off there, that resin. And then I repaired the stand. One of the things that I had to do was put it on slightly larger blocks, because you could barely almost anybody other than a child could barely get their knees underneath it. Well, I'm not sure what that tells us. I've had people say, oh, that shows that people were smaller in those days. I don't think that's true. I just think they were accustomed to playing instruments lower down. Earlier Broadwood pianos had one pedal on either leg. That was very difficult ergonomically to deal with. So now I'm going to take the camera and show you some of its the real details that you can see that tell us so much about this actual instrument. So one of the first things to observe about this instrument is how much it looks like a harpsichord. It has the square cheeks of a harpsichord. It has the pointed tail, although it's much longer and much larger and quite a bit deeper than an instrument, say, from the 1780s that you would have seen a French double built in Paris. But there are other things about it that are very un-harpsichord-like, and I'm going to talk about that. First of all, one of the improvements that John Broadwood made was to split the bridge into two pieces. So he's got the treble bridge ending somewhere in the tenor, and then there's a separate piece that runs right to the end of the instrument with a slight curve off at the end. And apparently he hired an acoustician or a scientist to improve his instruments and to make suggestions of the design, and this was one of his suggestions. Another thing to observe is the fact that there are no overspun strings. All of the strings are till about this point here are all brass, and then they are iron. So not spring steel, but iron. So that gives the sound a particular color. Now you can see more of these interesting handmade hardware features. This brass. These actually clasp. There's a little hook here, and it goes into this little hook here, and it enables you to close the instrument for transport. Now I want you to see how many little dark colored marks there are on the side and scratches. I tried to preserve all this. I didn't just change it all so that it was all polished and shiny anymore. I wanted to make sure that some of the history of the instrument was preserved. And we can see that from that, the color of that veneer, at one time the veneer banding, this mahogany here, would have been really red, and this would have been nearly white. But now, of course, those two have aged somewhat, and they've kind of gone together, but still the warmth of that wood is very apparent to the eye. Here's the serial number of the Broadwood, number 4553, written in pen on the rest plank. That's the piece of wood that holds the tuning pins on the bass side. And we were able to determine from this particular number that this is the only surviving grand from this year, 1809, in existence. There are a number of very interesting details to be observed if you take the lid off. One is on the right hand side here of the rest plank is the date written in pen. It's, even though this had to be cleaned a lot, it wasn't removed. Another interesting detail is the hardware for the jack rail. You can see that's a nice bit of brass work there, and over here the hook that holds the lid down. And this is the jack rail. This is just like a harpsichord's jack rail, very similar in structure. These cuts in it are made to accommodate the gap stretchers, which are these wrought iron pieces that prevent the gap from closing, because string tension will do that. And it's interesting to note that the one in the treble is considerably larger than the others and differently anchored. The other ones they have less tension to deal with, so the treble one is quite large. There's a couple of other little points here I want to note, and that is right here is the letter C. Looks like a G, but it's written in script, and it indicates where the C is. So the tuner can scratch into the rest plank right there, letter G. And there's some other little marks here you can see that tuners probably made while tuning the instrument. Broadwood maintained an entire crew of people who tuned pianos that Broadwood made. You can see from here the appearance of a very long instrument from the keyboard player's point of view, just how long it is, and that amazing set of strings, brass strings in the bass. An amazing piece of hardware. This is the bolt cover. There's a bolt that runs through it to this stretcher here, and the pedal lyre. Most pianos, modern pianos, of course, it's called a lyre, but it doesn't look like one. And the old pianos, they frequently did look like a lyre. Here are the 3 pedals made from wood. These 2 pedals control the dampers. This is the una corda. These are the handmade brass casters for this instrument, and it clearly shows that this is made for an era before broadloom, before carpets were used in most houses. Most houses would still have had plain wooden floors. One of the things that really fascinates me about this instrument is, where did it stay? What happened to it after someone bought it and took it home? At one time, this instrument would have been a very expensive instrument, all made by hand, by a number of people working at different benches. Somebody made the keyboard, somebody made the case, somebody did the stringing, and so on. And so it was a product of a tremendous amount of hand work. Now, one of the things you'll notice right away is this interesting ring. Well, somebody put a plant on this instrument and watered it repeatedly, and it left a ring. There's another ring over here where some other thing was gotten. You can see there's all sorts of little marks here. And you'll see also in the wood there are long scratches. And one particular favorite is over here, this squiggly one. That, to me, says this instrument was moved in a horse cart over cobblestones. There are plenty of other deep marks in the wood like that. They're all over the place. I'm not going to say this instrument was beaten up, but it wasn't treated all that well. If you think about it, it has quite a lot of wear on it, and we tried to preserve that all the way through. Some of these pieces of this is all mahogany. Now, one of the things about this is if you take a look at this entire lid here, right up to this point, this is one single piece of mahogany. So they had a log of mahogany that was that wide. Well, that wood's all gone now. You certainly never see that. The piece from here, there's a little join, and the piece on the end here, that's been added to. That's another piece. These other pieces are, the grain goes the other way, so that's a kind of a hinged thing. It's intended to go like this. This is called, there's a lock board there that goes into the lock, and so you can close it up and keep it closed when you're at home. Now we'll talk a little bit about the keywell area. One of the most extraordinary things about this instrument, actually the entire keyboard action and action are signed by a man named Chisholm. And my uncle, who was a bit of an amateur genealogist, did some research and found that the Chisholm family worked for Broadwood for quite a while, and he spent quite a long part of his career working for Broadwood. He probably had one bench that he every day came and made Broadwood pianos, and the keyboard is an amazing piece of work. It's all done by hand, ebony and ivory. The little ivory pieces are slips. This is a reverse of the procedure that you saw with lots of the French instruments and German-speaking countries, instruments, Austria, Germany. Many of those instruments had reverse. They were using ebony for the main key and ivory tops or bone tops. There's some really nice hardware here, and all this veneer is all satinwood and rosewood. It's amazingly well done. The blocks on the ends can be taken out, and then the entire action is removed in a single piece. The centerpiece of this is a beautiful inlaid piece of boxwood, which reads, John Broadwood and Sons, Makers to His Majesty and the Princesses, Great Pulteney Street, Golden Square, London. Later, this was all done with a pen or maybe a burning device, I'm not sure exactly which. And there's stringing around it. All of that, of course, went away, and it was eventually replaced with brass. Now we're going to talk a little bit with Susan. She's going to come and demonstrate the instrument a little bit to you, and we'll talk about its musical properties. So here we are. I'm going to talk with Susan, who plays the piano. And what do you think about it, Susan?
I've learned a lot playing this piano. Some things that are in Beethoven's sonatas always seemed mystifying to me. And when I started playing them on this piano, I realized why they were written the way they were written.
Well, one of the things that for many years of listening to this piano now, because we've had it since 2007, and it's changed a lot over that time.
Yes.
At first it was kind of a little bit, I would say, a little dull, and especially the treble did not seem very promising. I was a bit disappointed, considering how much work went into bringing it back. But over the years, it certainly changed a great deal again. Once the tension was all resolved, and you started playing it, and it's just amazing. It blossomed. It's incredible what it does now. And one of the extraordinary things about it is how deeply registered it is. So the bass, middle, treble, the tenor, they all sound so different. And when you hear this effect, it's quite different from a modern piano, because the color of the sound itself is so different. You'd have no trouble telling the treble from when the little tinky notes on top are played versus the heavy bass notes, which have a lot more string energy. You have no trouble. There's no idea that one is overwhelming the other, which I often hear that in modern pianos, that they seem so kind of blended. And not to say that there's anything wrong with that. Of course, in later music, that's exactly what we want. But in this music, it seems like registration is something that really helps.
Well, I would say anytime you're playing a new instrument, whether it's newly restored or a newly built instrument, it really is not going to sound anything like it will eventually sound for at least a year. And that was certainly true with this instrument. It has leather covering the hammers, as you know, instead of felt. And so that leather really has to get played in. I can recall an amusing moment when I was playing this instrument and usually if I have a new instrument to play, I play a lot of scales, not because I love them, but because you play all the notes, and if you're playing a piece, you're only playing some of the notes. So there I was, merely playing all of the scales, which I have played for many, many years, and I was cracking a lot of notes. And I thought, why? And as I stared disconsolately at the keyboard, I realized that the group of 2 black keys on this keyboard is further apart than the group of 3 black keys, and I've never seen any other instrument like that.
That's amazing.
And if I ever meet Mr. Chisholm in another dimension, I might discuss that.
Well, those are the sorts of things that the quirkiness of old instruments certainly is a feature. That you see these old instruments, and the ones that are in museums, of course, are the ones that have been preserved for other reasons than their musical usefulness.
Yes.
Often, their decorative values are often overwhelming their musical instrument value. The ones that were played into dust.
Well, that's often true. The really good working instruments we no longer have.
Yeah,
we have the
we're
ones.
very lucky that this one was left
very
alone.
Lucky. It was in a terrible state, but by the same token, it was not subjected to a bad
Right, and I would just want to point out that when we first received it, somebody had tried to change the leather hammers back to felt.
Yes.
And so the moths had thought that was a great idea,
Yes,
and they had
did.
eaten huge chunks out of it.
It was really
It was really awful. Another thing they had tried to do was to change the stringing to heavier stringing, and of course that caused other problems. The strings all broke. There were many broken strings when we first saw it.
Yes.
It took a lot of work to get it to go back to where it was. The tuning pins had been replaced with more modern ones with a hexagonal section that would fit a modern tuning hammer. And so we opted for the old traditional style where you literally take a bar of mild iron, cut it into chunks, and hammer it flat so that it's got two little sides on the tuning hammer just engages on those. It's a little bit odd to tune in that respect because you don't have a really tight fit, but I've
Well,
never
that's
found
true.
a problem with it.
You know, we were fortunate that the rest plank, a piece of wood that holds all the tuning pins,
All in good shape.
was in good shape
Yeah.
in spite of having this
Yeah.
extra tension on it.
Yeah.
Because with pianos, that is very difficult to fix.
So now why don't we talk a little bit about the pedal, because we know the pedal on this
the
instrument
pedal.
is one of its most distinguished and interesting features.
Well, it is, because as well as being, as you were pointing out, very vividly registered through the range, the pedal operates half of the keyboard at a time. So the pedal on the right will lift the dampers middle C end up, and the pedal on the left does the bass. And really in Beethoven sonatas there are quite a few places where one hand is playing a lot of staccato notes and the other hand you kind of want to pedal.
Right, yeah.
And it's very difficult to do on a modern piano. You sort of dab the pedal and try to maintain enough of each quality of detachment and smoothness that you can sort of get this idea across, but it's very fiddly and tricky. And of course if you then go to a concert and play on a different piano, all of your hard work really...
I would just point out one of the big changes in notation, for example, in 19th century music, later music of the, say, past 1850, is often the pedaling is very specifically marked in, and plenty of Victorian editions that you find, older editions of Beethoven and other composers, have the pedaling all carefully marked in there.
Yes.
But of course, in these early editions, such
But
as
in
the
these,
facsimiles, no pedaling marked.
There's no pedaling marked in.
No.
And I would extend that further and say that the touch, variations in the touch are also not always notated. Just as in harpsichord music, if you're playing broken chords, say, it was, depending on the piece, it was quite usual to hold a lot of those notes down, even if that
Yeah.
wasn't written.
Yeah.
And there are parts of these sonatas where that works very well also.
Now, I just want to demonstrate to the viewers here just how simple the damping on this instrument is. It's just a jack, like a harpsichord jack, with a tiny little bit of felt, and really the damping isn't really all that great.
Well, that's part of the charm.
And part of the, exactly, it's
this
part of the
type
sound color of the
piano.
instrument.
And you'll hear when I play it that there's a sort of build-up in the resonance which changes as you go through
Right.
the piece. It's like a shadow version of the piece, sort of.
Can you demonstrate a little bit of that somehow?
I will. I would say in German they have a word for this called Nachspiel. In English we don't have a word for it.
Yeah.
But it's like the
After ring,
afterglow
after
of
sound.
the sound.
Yeah, or it's kind of like a built-in reverb almost.
Yes. And it would be very interesting to hear just those sounds without the principal pitches. I don't know
Then
how
you'd hear it
anyone
more
would
clearly.
ever do that. Yeah, I was sort of looking for, well, for example, in the last movement of this Opus 14 that we just recorded, there are many places where you hear silence after a lot of notes.
Yeah, you can hear all this stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
all these overtones.
You can hear it sort of vibrates.
Yeah.
It shimmers.
Yeah, I agree.
Very interesting effect.
Mhm.
And not something we would value on a modern piano. You want your
Clarity.
piano
Yeah,
to damp
to damp
much better
very
than
well.
that.
Yeah.
Because by then the music had other characteristics and you were trying to make other effects with it.
On modern pianos, the felt is kind of shaped to actually fit like wedges between, especially
On
in
the
the
bass strings
tenor
it
and in the
is,
bass
yes,
strings.
yes.
And they don't just sit on there; they're actually spring-loaded against the
Yes.
string. So this is just gravity.
No,
And
if
very
our
little weight.
Bechstein were damping like this, I would be on the phone to the technician today.
Exactly. This is a big difference with period instruments.
Yes,
they don't
yes.
have these technical things. They aren't all spring-loaded and have weights and stuff that make them heavier. Actually, the over-ringing sound is a valued property.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I wouldn't say it compensates for not having all of the volume and power of a
that's
modern
true.
instrument, but it's a difference, and it makes the sound of the instrument very live.
Well, we should point out just to to advise people that there's much less tension on these strings than
Yes.
there is naturally. This is, as I suggested at the beginning, there's no metal frame holding this back. It's only wood
Yes.
and these metal gap stretchers.
And because of that, over time, all early pianos tend to get what
They
they
go
call
like
cheek
this.
warp. They twist a little bit.
This
from
one's done a
tension.
bit since we had it fixed.
It has changed a little bit, but
But
it's still in
it's
good
still
playing
fine,
condition,
yeah.
so it's no problem.
Beethoven's own piano was completely unplayable. And I don't know, I didn't really say that at the beginning, but Franz Liszt was the one who actually owned Beethoven's own piano.
Yes.
And then I think it was restored in 1993 or 1995, something like that. A few recordings were made. It went on a concert tour around Europe a little bit, if you can imagine that. And it had been restored sensitively so that it wasn't just, because it had been kind of fixed by people who were trying to modernize it, as ours had been. That exactly the same mentality, that we would like to fix these things that we think are wrong, instead of, as we now think, we would like it to be as it was and not changed into something new.
Well, that's one reason why I like the medium of making a video, because we don't have to move this thing.
Yeah.
And really, the thought of dragging an old
And we have
piano
done this.
around Europe is rather nauseating.
No, indeed. But we've had to move this instrument to concerts
we
and
have.
back, and we
to
always think
to do a recording,
it's a big risk.
It
We
is.
always go, oh
It
dear, what
is.
are we doing?
The instrument gets a little upset.
Yeah,
Everything's
yeah,
a little
yeah. It's not-
jiggled up.
Almost everybody's got a story of how their instrument was dropped or
please,
cracked.
I don't think about
no, we
those
don't even
things.
like to think about
No.
that. So, is there a passage we could demonstrate? Because you talked a little bit to me about one part where you worked out this new kind of a pedaling idea that you had for a certain movement.
Ah, yes.
Maybe we
Well,
could have that demonstrated, and then we'll wrap up our video.
Actually, I have two different ones, because of course you can do either half of the keyboard. So, well, in the development of the first movement, for example, there's sort of Beethoven being rather characteristically gruff. And so here I pedal the top half of the keyboard. So you can hear all those detached notes in the bass.
Right. So
while
what
I'm
you mean
getting
is
nice.
that the pedal isn't up, the dampers are not up in
the dampers are up on top. But it's
then there's
damping
resting down
normally
on the bottom
That's
half of the
right.
keyboard.
Now at the end of the third movement of this piece, we have the other situation. So it's a bit tricky when you're playing, because you've got to get your foot right, ooh, and sometimes you get a squeak right in between.
Yeah, that shows
there.
it's old.
Yeah, I'm starting to squeak too. Anyway, so then we have, you'll hear the dampers lift more in the bass. Now, you see, I haven't got it right because I'm there. Okay, let's try this again. So you can
Fantastic.
hear that.
Yeah, you really can hear
It
it.
sort of doesn't
Yeah.
even sound like a piano. It's like a hurdy-gurdy or
Yeah.
something. It's quite
I just tuned it this
effective.
morning, so it sounds
Yeah, it sounds
particularly
really
good
good.
right now. Yeah.
But you do have to be very careful not to catch that other pedal, and it's a good thing I can get my feet in between there.
Yeah, and there's three pedals, so
Yes, and the other one
what
is
does
a
the other one do?
corda, which
Yeah.
moves the whole action.
There's a rather mysterious feature too, and at the end of the keyboard there's a little block that slides up and down, and you
Yes.
hold it up and slide it over, and it goes to one string. So you can
Yes.
do one string, two strings, or three strings. And I
Yes.
understand in a later Beethoven sonata, he calls for this effect. And of course, this is not on. You can't do this on a modern instrument.
No, well, I think that's probably, you're thinking of the Opus 27 dubbed The Moonlight,
The Moonlight.
where it says you should play it without sordina, and there was some discussion, does that mean you shouldn't use mute, but in fact
Yeah.
it means you should lift the dampers.
Yeah.
There shouldn't be any
There's even
dampers on
discussion
the
about whether
strings.
sordino means pedal or mute.
Yeah,
Because there may have been a
exactly.
completely different thing, like on a harpsichord with the sort
Yeah.
of buff stop. They used the Viennese instruments often had bassoon stops and little bells attached and all kinds of little noise-making devices,
Yes.
because this was considered to be kind of a thing that you could easily do to try to turn the instrument into a kind of automated thing, it's a machine-like thing, because that's a bit of a fascination in that early 19th century period. They were fascinated by automaton.
Well, what goes around comes around. Now you buy a keyboard and it has, 100 different instruments.
Now we have artificial intelligence.
Yes, so. But we do not have resonance.
No, we do. That's true. On electric keyboards, generally we don't have that.
We don't
right.
have that.
Maybe that will be, eventually they will be able to sample this and it can be digitally suggested.
It would take some pretty fancy math.
I think
Because, of
so.
course, it changes depending on the notes you play.
Exactly.
So that's what makes it tricky.
Yeah. Okay. So is there something we can do to wrap this up now?
Gee.
Just maybe play the ending. Oh, one of the things that you got at the end of one of the movements is where there's all these little. It's a kind of it's a sort of a Haydn surprise symphony thing where he's got all these quiet chords and then wham, he hits you with this big loud chord.
Yeah.
And that's a real indication to me that he was taking advantage of the instrument's expanded dynamic range over the older Viennese instruments.
Yes, I think that's true, and just, the effects that were available to him. So this is, at the end of this, it's a march with variations.
Amazing. So that's it from us for today. Hope you enjoyed that.
Bye.